Some robberies unfold with guns, panic, and blood, but some are carried out with an entirely different weapon: silence. On January 13th, 2006, in Argentina, a heist took place exactly like that. At 12:38 p.m., police in Buenos Aires received a bank robbery report. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the robbers were still inside. The building was the Rio Bank, one of the country's largest financial institutions. Based on initial impressions, the robbery appeared to have failed. Meanwhile, one of the robbers grabbed a hostage and tried to flee the building. But when he saw the police had surrounded the place, he panicked. With no other option, he fearfully retreated inside, where he and his 4 accomplices realized they were trapped, and so they waited for their inevitable fate. That's what it looked like from the outside. Inside, an entirely different story was unfolding. No rush, no panic. Even the fear was performed, like actors playing a role. Over the radio, a man who identified himself as Walter announced they would not surrender. Then, oddly, he said they were hungry and asked the police for pizza, promising to give themselves up once it arrived. Just minutes after the pizza was delivered, the building fell into complete silence. For the next 3 hours, officials grew increasingly anxious as every attempt to reach Walter went unanswered. Finally, a special forces team refused to wait any longer and stormed the building at 7 p.m., and what they found stopped them cold. The hostages were safe. More than 150 deposit boxes had been emptied, and the robbers gone, every single one of them. The bank had only 2 exits, both under police control since the moment the siege began. Every window in the building was intact, and the robbers were nowhere among the hostages. What no one knew, what was truly shocking, was this. While everything on the upper floor looked like a classic bank robbery, the real heist had been happening underground. The hostage situation everyone was watching was nothing more than a diversion, a performance designed to buy time. The mastermind behind it all was a man named Fernando Araujo, and what he had just pulled off would soon be known as the heist of the century, the most ingeniously executed robbery in history. Yet no one yet knew that these 7 men were about to go down in history as the most legendary thieves the world had ever seen. So how did 7 men outwit an entire nation and vanish into thin air under the watch of more than 300 police officers? It all started with a man named Fernando Araujo. A martial arts expert, Fernando visited his psychologist in the early 2000s and told him he wanted to do something that would reignite his passion for life. When the psychologist asked what he had in mind, Fernando told him he wanted to rob a bank. The psychologist laughed, thinking it was impossible. Fernando was dead serious, and he'd already started planning. He began by riding his motorcycle through the Acasuso neighborhood, scouting banks. One caught his attention above all others: the Rio Bank, a massive and enormously popular institution where roughly 80% of Argentinians kept their money. The bank offered a private safe deposit box service, where clients could store valuables like gold, jewelry, diamonds, and cash. Fernando initially considered 2 approaches. The first was a direct armed assault, high risk, low reward. The second was sneaking into the vault room at night and stealing everything. That option promised a bigger payoff, but it was nearly impossible thanks to security cameras and heat sensors directly connected to the police. Despite these obstacles, Fernando kept thinking of a way to get inside undetected. At one point, he considered tunneling beneath the bank, but that would take months and would almost certainly be noticed. Then, by chance, he spotted something on the street in front of the bank, a series of manhole covers spaced about 10 meters apart. He followed them and discovered that the main sewer line ended at a river, roughly 160 meters from the bank, giving him a direct underground route. The Palermo district of Buenos Aires sits above a vast network of stormwater tunnels that run beneath the streets and drain into the river. Fernando realized that all he needed to do was dig a tunnel from that sewer system toward the bank's vault. And so the next phase began, what he called Project Donatello. He didn't name it after the Renaissance artist. He named it after the Ninja Turtles. After all, they lived in the sewers and practiced martial arts. Over the following months, Fernando refined his plan and assembled his team. The first person he recruited was his closest friend since high school, Sebastian Bolster. When Fernando first told him the idea, Sebastian wasn't exactly enthusiastic. The two had grown up together in middle-class families, but they were very different men. While Fernando chased unconventional, sometimes illegal, passions, Sebastian was a law-abiding family man, a skilled mechanic who spent his days fixing motorcycles and jet skis. He had no interest in crime and, having once worked at a bank, knew they weren't easy targets. But he deeply hated financial institutions. In 2001, a catastrophic combination of reckless banking practices and disastrous political decisions had triggered one of the worst economic crises in Argentina's history, perhaps the worst ever. Almost overnight, people from every walk of life lost their savings. The public came to despise both the banks and the politicians who had allowed it to happen. Sebastian and his family had lost a considerable amount of money in the collapse. He told Fernando he would join, but only if Fernando guaranteed there would be no violence, no real weapons, not even guns. Fernando agreed completely. He wanted this to be something artistic, something elegant. Violence had no place in his vision, but one obstacle bothered them more than anything else. How would they disable the bank's alarm system while the building was empty? So they made a decision. They wouldn't go in at night. They would go in during business hours, when the alarms were inactive. When Sebastian asked how they would pull that off, Fernando smiled. By creating a distraction. The plan was this. While the bank was open, they would stage a fake robbery on the surface floor. While the entire country focused on that spectacle, they would slip through a tunnel they'd dug from the sewer to the basement vault, silently clean out every deposit box, and then escape back through the tunnel. In other words, the tunnel wasn't for getting in, it was for getting out. No one had ever done anything like it before. Sebastian posed as a wealthy client looking to store gold, and visited the bank with a hidden camera, filming the interior of the vault room. Fernando, posing as an architecture student, called the city's public works department and gathered information about how deep the ground could support tunneling. Together, they obtained detailed city maps and the bank's exact floor plans, and the picture became clearer. But there was a critical question. What was the correct angle for a tunnel stretching from an underground sewer channel to the foundation of the bank above? Even a slight miscalculation could send them into a neighbor's basement. The answer, of course, was mathematics. Sebastian knew that if he had two sides of a right triangle, he could calculate the exact angle. He needed two measurements: the vertical distance from street level down to the floor of the sewer channel, and the horizontal distance from the tunnel's starting point to the bank's outer wall. For the first measurement, Fernando rode his bicycle to the bank one day, found a storm drain, and lowered a string with a weight tied to the end. When the weight hit the channel floor, he had his vertical distance. For the horizontal measurement, he needed to pace out the distance from the manhole cover, the tunnel's starting point, to the bank wall. But he couldn't walk around measuring things with a tape measure without raising suspicion. So instead, he measured the circumference of his bicycle wheel, then one night quietly rolled the bike from the manhole cover to the bank wall, counting every full rotation by watching the air valve. The distance came to 37.5 rotations, approximately 56 meters. With all the figures in hand, the math pointed to one answer. The tunnel had to be dug at a 69-degree angle, descending 15 meters underground. But a job of this magnitude required a more professional crew. Neither of them had the criminal expertise to carry out something this complex. Fernando reached out to a third member, known only as the Doctor. The Doctor was a lawyer and seasoned professional thief, whose real identity remains unknown to this day. He was also the man who would bring the rest of the team together. The crew he assembled included Beto Latorre, a gifted con artist and master of persuasion; Mario Solanes, a Uruguayan thief with multiple prison sentences to his name; Julian Zalo Echevarria, the getaway driver; and one more person, known only as the Kid, a reliable partner whose identity has never been revealed. Whatever their individual histories, every one of them was prepared to rob a bank without harming a single innocent person. The team spent roughly a year in preparation. During that time, they purchased an extraordinary range of equipment, heavy-duty machinery, diving gear, boats, and toys. Among other things, the plan as established called for digging a tunnel, roughly 15 meters long, from the sewer to the vault. Sebastian took on the digging. Night after night, he descended beneath the streets with a hydraulic jackhammer, chipping through solid earth, inching closer to the bank. His wife noticed his long absences but had no idea what he was actually doing. She simply assumed he was having an affair. Among Sebastian's most important tasks was figuring out how to open the deposit boxes. He rented a box at the bank, quietly noted the manufacturer's brand, then purchased several identical units directly from the factory. Whatever method he used had to be fast, powerful, and above all, silent. That ruled out explosives. Cutting was out too, since it would produce dangerous fumes. So he designed a custom device powerful enough to crack the locks, yet fast and silent enough to avoid detection. He built it in sections so it could be carried in, assembled inside the vault, and quickly disassembled for transport. He called it the Powerball. With the Powerball, they could rip open the boxes in rapid succession. But how would they get the loot out of the bank? Carrying it by hand through the tunnel was nearly impossible given the volume. That's when someone proposed using boats. But there was a problem. The water level in the sewer channel was often too shallow. A boat loaded with cash and valuables could scrape the bottom. So Sebastian built a small dam inside the channel to raise the water level. Then came another concern. What if the police figured out they'd escaped through the sewers? The obvious move would be to head toward the river, but that would be the first place police would look. Fernando wanted every possible advantage. A better idea: go the other direction, deeper into the sewer system. That way they could emerge anywhere in the city. While the entire police force was occupied with a hostage crisis, roughly a kilometer away, a getaway vehicle would be parked directly over a manhole cover, with the driver waiting inside. To make the exit seamless, the team bought an old minibus and cut a hole in its floor, so when the moment came, they could climb straight from the manhole into the vehicle without ever setting foot on the street. They would simply disappear. After 2 years of planning, January 13th, 2006 arrived. The 7 men went through their normal morning routines, then began their final preparations. Some of the crew met at a cafe for coffee. While there, they applied glue to their fingertips to avoid leaving prints. Then they drove off in 3 stolen cars, 2 heading toward the bank, the getaway minibus heading to the rendezvous point. Sebastian went separately. He drove to the river alone, entered the tunnel around 9 a.m. and waited for the signal. The first to enter the bank were Beto and the doctor, one dressed as a client, the other wearing a disguise. Beto reached into his jacket and pulled out a toy pistol, borrowed that morning from his 9-year-old son, waved it around, and ordered everyone to the floor. This is a robbery. Meanwhile, Mario and the kid drove one of the stolen cars into the bank's underground garage. They unloaded the Powerball and the rest of their equipment, then locked the garage door, using the car as a barricade. The 2 men then joined their partners upstairs. Fernando, meanwhile, parked another car alongside the bank and left it idling with the hazard lights on, meant to look like the getaway vehicle. The back seat was stuffed with nails and oil cans, the kind of things a fleeing crew might scatter on the road to slow pursuing police cars. Then he put on a baseball cap and sunglasses and walked into the bank. Within 15 minutes, nearly 300 police officers had surrounded the building, 300 officers against 7 men. Snipers took up positions on every rooftop with a sightline to the bank. When the police established phone contact with the robbers, Mario stepped forward and introduced himself as Walter. Officers soon dubbed him the man in the gray suit because of what he was wearing. His job was twofold: buy the team downstairs enough time to empty the vault, and convince the police that this was nothing more than a failed robbery gone sideways. Mario told the police his team was armed and prepared to use deadly force if necessary. This was a complete lie. Every single weapon they carried was a replica, a toy. They'd been designed so convincingly that neither the hostages nor the police could tell the difference. The robbers maintained total control of the situation inside the bank. while simultaneously performing the role of desperate, cornered criminals. At one point, the security guard from the surveillance room was forced out of the bank at gunpoint. There were 2 reasons for this. First, they didn't want a single real weapon inside the building, because someone might actually use it. Second, they didn't want him relaying information to the outside. After that, the security cameras were repositioned and disabled. At around 1:30 p.m., the signal was sent down to Sebastian, break through the wall. He carefully punched through and got to work immediately. Assembling the Powerball took 20 minutes, but once it was running, he tore through the deposit boxes at remarkable speed, maintaining that pace for the better part of 90 minutes. The loot began piling up around him. Once things were running smoothly below, Fernando and the doctor came down and began loading the valuables into bags. Around 3 p.m., the team upstairs released a second hostage, then a third. Shortly after, one of the robbers grabbed another hostage and made a show of trying to escape, only to be forced back inside by the police cordon. This deepened the impression that the robbery had completely unraveled. At 3:30 p.m., Mario called the police again. He said they were boxed in, and since they'd be going to prison for a long time, they wanted pizza and drinks before giving themselves up. The police agreed. It bought them another 40 minutes. When the pizza arrived, Mario put down the phone and warned the hostages that the team needed to hold a meeting, and that anyone who moved would be shot. No one moved. Down in the vault, the situation was this. In roughly 2.5 hours, they had cracked open 143 deposit boxes. It was time to go. The performance upstairs couldn't last forever. Sebastian broke the Powerball into pieces and handed them off to the men waiting in the tunnel, then cleaned the room. He set up a series of decoy bombs, fake devices to slow any pursuit, and then slipped into the tunnel. Fernando and the doctor were the last to leave. One of them poured bleach across the floor to destroy DNA traces. The other scattered a fistful of human hair, bought from a barber shop, across the room, designed to send investigators chasing phantom suspects. Once every trace was dealt with, they entered the tunnel and dragged a large cabinet in front of the hole. Anyone entering the vault would find a room that appeared untouched, with no obvious explanation for where 6 armed men had gone. Below, 2 inflatable boats were waiting, one motorized. The crew climbed down, loaded the bags, and began moving through the darkness toward their designated exit point. Not everything went perfectly. The motor wouldn't start, but they'd planned for this. Paddles were distributed, and they rowed in silence through the depths of the sewer system. When they reached the exit point, a pulley system they'd rigged days earlier swung into action. The bags were hoisted up one by one toward the minibus above. Once the last man had climbed out, they pulled the ladder up behind them, leaving nothing below. The boats drifted off into the dark current and vanished. The team sealed the manhole cover, walked calmly to the minibus, and drove away, to a secret meeting point where they would divide the money. When they turned on the television, they couldn't believe what they saw. The police still hadn't entered the bank. 7 hours after it all began, law enforcement finally lost its patience and stormed the building. Inside, they found hostages lying motionless on the floor, and a silence so complete it was unsettling. At first, officers suspected the robbers had blended in with the hostages. The hostages were questioned aggressively, so aggressively that some of them later complained that the robbers had treated them far better than the police did. Everyone was searched. No suspects were found, but the robbers had left something behind. On the floor, laid out in a neat row, a collection of toy guns, and above them, taped to the wall, a handwritten note. It read, "We are in a wealthy neighborhood. We have no weapons and no hatred. This isn't about love. It's about money. We have no intention of harming anyone. This isn't personal. It's just business." Nobody understood how they'd escaped, not until a bank employee noticed a wardrobe that had been slightly moved from its usual position. When they pulled it aside, they found a hole in the wall, and beyond the hole, a tunnel leading down into the sewer system. The mysterious gang that had humiliated the Argentine police had escaped without firing a single shot, making off with approximately $20 million in cash and an estimated 80 kilograms of jewelry and valuables worth millions more. It was a perfect heist. The take was enormous. The police had nothing. Fernando and his crew appeared to have pulled off the heist of the century and seemed destined to enjoy their fortunes in peace. They divided the money, went their separate ways, and agreed never to see each other again. The day after the robbery, Sebastian collected every credit card they'd found in the deposit boxes and scattered them around various manhole covers across the city, all far from their real exit point. Ordinary people who stumbled upon the cards tried using them at ATMs, hoping they still worked. Each swipe triggered an alert, sending police scrambling to investigate false leads across the city, chasing ghosts. In the weeks that followed, it seemed like the robbers would never be caught. Then, 5 weeks after the heist, one team member's personal life brought the whole operation down. Beto noticed that some of his share of the money had gone missing. When he confronted his wife, Alicia, a violent argument erupted. Furious, Alicia walked straight to the police and told them everything, that her husband was one of the robbers, and everything she knew about the heist. She knew a great deal. In the days before the robbery, she had seen several of the men in her garage, helping Beto prepare the getaway vehicle. Police arrested 5 members of the crew in rapid succession. So in the end, what unraveled this masterpiece of planning wasn't an alarm. It wasn't brilliant detective work. What destroyed it was the small fracture that grows in private, the crack that starts with a few missing banknotes and becomes a war inside the walls of a home. The doctor and the kid, the two who had never been to Beto's house, never appeared on the police's radar. They were never charged, and though the legendary robbers were finally caught, none of them served more than 3 years in prison. The short sentences came down to 2 things. They had used toy weapons instead of real ones, and the entire operation had ended without a single injury. Even after their convictions, none of them expressed remorse. If anything, the general sense among them was that this had been one of the greatest achievements of their lives. As for the stolen money, its total value has never been fully established to this day. Only a fraction was ever recovered. The Rio Bank robbery may not hold the record for the largest sum ever stolen, but it remains one of the most daring, creative, and perfectly executed heists in the history of the world. And that brings us to the end of this incredible story. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.